So this is Whitney. Yes, the Whitney Houston, the GOAT vocalist. Argue with your mama. Now, Whitney was a lot of things, but one thing you may or may not know is Whitney was the true definition of a ride or die chick. I mean, she was a straight G. She was willing to do anything for her man. So this story begins with her husband, Bobby. Now back then, Bobby was rolling in that snow. So one day, Bobby gets a kilo of that cocoa for $25,000 from this dude named Luke. Now at the time, Bobby didn't have the whole $25,000 or he didn't want to pay it. So he got it from Luke on consignment. But of course, when it came time for him to pay up, Bobby got missing. This made Luke very upset. So one night while Luke is in Atlantic City popping bottles, he happens to stumble upon this big time gangster named Preacher. Now, he's talking with Preacher about the situation with Bobby and how he's looking for Bobby and how Bobby owes him the money. Now, upon Preacher hearing this, he comes up with this way for him to come up big time cheese. So he tells Luke, listen, I'll give you $10,000 right now, and the debt belongs to me. I'll be responsible for collecting from Bobby. Luke figures, shoot, okay. He gets his $10,000 right now, and Preacher sets his plan in motion. See, what Luke didn't know was Preacher was familiar with a lot of the local hangout spots and clubs that Bobby used to frequent back then. So Preacher hired this baddie to hang around one of Bobby's usual club spots. And when she sees Bobby, try to flirt with him, try to lure him outside. And Bobby wouldn't suspect anything out of the ordinary, because back then he was getting all kinds of attention from the ladies. So one night, she was finally able to lure him outside of the club to talk. That's when Bobby was ambushed. A van pulled up, dudes hopped out, grabbed Bobby and threw him in the back of the van and drove off. They brought him to this apartment in the Bronx. With his hands tied and his mouth gagged, Preacher and his crew beat the crap out of Bobby in an effort to get him to repay the $25,000. After a while, Preacher got tired of hearing Bobby beg and plead, saying how he didn't have the money right now, so he was just gonna end Bobby right then and there. Bobby, realizing that his fate was almost kind of sealed, he makes one last request. He begs Preacher, hey look, let me just call my wife and we can sort this whole thing out. Preacher and his crew paused when they heard that request, but eventually Preacher let him call Whitney. And sure enough, Whitney picked up the phone and Preacher and Whitney began to negotiate. And Preacher must have been a good negotiator because the debt went from $25,000 to $400,000. So Preacher, being unsure if he's actually talking to the Whitney Houston or not, says that she needs to bring the money in the next hour. The whole $400,000. And not to call any cops, not to have any security or anything like that. Come alone. Tell me why. After an hour or so, a small framed woman wearing oversized sunglasses and a disheveled wig shows up in a cab. She stepped straight out the cab and made her way to that apartment alone. She walks into the apartment holding a bag with $400,000 in it, throws the bag on the floor and says, go get Bobby, get him now. She actually came by herself with the money. So those dudes went to the back, grabbed Bobby and brought him out. Now, mind you, he's still tied up, he's still gagged. They stripped him naked. She made them untie Bobby and she was like, yo, go get Bobby's clothes. They brought him out and she left with her husband. These dudes were taken so aback by the fact that Whitney Houston actually showed up to the projects by herself and kind of walked into the room and carried herself like, y'all gonna do what I tell you to do. They were thoroughly impressed. Now, mind you, this is during the I will always love you part of Whitney's career. This is like the height of her success. Some people would even say what she did here was incredibly reckless. But for everything Whitney was, she was someone who loved hard. As for Preacher and his crew, their murderous plots and racketeering crimes eventually caught up with them and they all caught heavy sentences. And in order to avoid the death penalty in connection with like 13 homicides in this one big drug case, Preacher kind of just snitched on everybody in his crew anyway. Crazy, right? Now, please keep in mind, this is the personal account of a man named David Collins, who was a member of the Preacher crew at the time. He says he was there. There is no police report or court case about this one. So if you want to take this with a grain of salt, I completely understand. But anyway, RIP the GOAT.
So I don't care what the fuck she was doing, smoking, sniffing, or whatever the fuck she was doing. She came to get that money. You got gangsters sitting there with guns in their hands. She was gangster.